Have you ever considered that we might be living on the ruins of an ancient civilization? On the surface, everything looks normal: roads, bridges, cities. But what if I told you that all these man-made structures could be part of a massive global network that someone destroyed? What if we, the so-called pinnacle of evolution, are actually just the descendants of those who survived a catastrophe that wiped out that civilization? Why do some gigantic bridges lead to empty valleys, their scale defying all logic? Why build such structures in places where no one ever lived? And what if I told you these constructions could have been part of an energy grid that provided the planet with free power? We lost that key to freedom, and someone, perhaps from the very beginning, knew we could never be allowed to access those technologies again. In this video, we'll explore why these bridges and viaducts, which look like simple historic monuments, might actually be something far greater. Not just pieces of infrastructure, but parts of a gigantic, ruined energy system. We'll show you shocking facts that official science tries to hide. And at the end, I'll ask you a question that could overturn everything you thought you knew about our past. Don't go away. The most interesting part is just beginning. Stop for a moment and look around. Are you so sure you know the history of the world you live in? We're used to thinking of progress as something continuous, from the digging stick to the wheel, from the steam engine to the smartphone. We're confident it's all an upward trajectory, that this straight line of progress is the whole truth about our civilization. But what if it's not? What if the very idea of linear progress is just an illusion? What if we aren't the pinnacle of evolution, but rather the descendants of those who lived in a more advanced civilization, one we know almost nothing about? Think about it. Everything we consider the peak of human genius might just be the traces of that ancient, vanished civilization, which we then claim as our own. We build skyscrapers, lay roads, create new technologies, but this could simply be an attempt to adapt to what was left behind by a more powerful and technologically advanced era. We found the remnants, adapted to them, and now call them our achievements. The construction of bridges, these giant engineering feats, perhaps they weren't built for us, but to preserve our access to the energy, knowledge, and technology of the past. But as powerful as this theory is, it starts with simple questions we might never have asked. Why are there such mysterious structures in the world as giant bridges and viaducts that lead to nowhere? Why build such incredible objects in places with no major cities or industrial centers? Why did their construction require such gigantic resources and technology that surpasses even our own today? These questions, which we tend to ignore, might reveal a secret hidden from us for centuries. We only see the remnants of this great past, but we don't know how to interpret them correctly. Now, imagine we could shatter the familiar myth of linear progress and understand that humanity actually went through cyclical eras, each one erased by a global catastrophe. What we see is not the beginning, but a recovery. Bridges and viaducts aren't just architectural monuments. They stand in the most unexpected places, in empty fields, deep forests, valleys that never had large settlements. Official history claims these structures were built for railways, but something about that explanation doesn't add up. Remember what life was like in the 19th century. The main transport was a horse and cart, and the planet's population was a fraction of what it is now. Then, suddenly, for no apparent reason, industrialists and rulers begin constructing giant bridges designed to last for centuries. So why build such infrastructure in empty places? It's important to understand that bridge construction always requires significant investment. Even by today's standards, it's millions of dollars. And in the 19th century, it would have been billions. But who would spend that kind of money on gigantic structures in places with no major cities, industrial centers, or roads used by tens of thousands of people? This raises a question with no obvious answer. Why was it decided to build such massive objects in the middle of nowhere? Think logically. In any other situation, when building infrastructure, the city or industrial hub comes first, and then roads and bridges are built to connect them. Bridges and railways aren't just construction projects, they're vital arteries for a functioning city. But with these monumental structures, it's the opposite. This is infrastructure that exists without any connection to a developed territory, without any apparent need for it. The question remains open. For whom and why were such giant objects built in places that clearly didn't require such complexity and scale? It was preparation for something far greater. Take, for example, the famous Gulch Viaduct in Germany, the largest brick bridge in the world. It's over half a kilometer long and 78 meters high. Officially, it's stated that 26 million bricks were used in its construction. We're told it was built in 5 years, from 1846 to 1851. The immediate question is, how could such a huge bridge be built in only 5 years? Let's do the math. There are 365 days in a year, so over 5 years, that's about 1,800 days. To lay 26 million bricks, workers would have had to lay 14,000 bricks every single day, with no weekends, holidays, or even winter breaks. And this wasn't just simple wall construction, but a complex arched structure requiring precise calculations and time for the mortar to set. But the main mystery isn't how they could have done it, but where did the bricks come from? There were no large factories in the area capable of producing such volumes. To fire 26 million bricks, you'd need a huge amount of coal and specialized kilns. But strangely, there are no traces of this industry around. Where are the quarries they took the clay from? Where are the giant kilns for firing? The landscape around the bridge is pristine. It almost feels like these bricks appeared from nowhere, or, even more likely, the bridge itself was there long before people started restoring it and claiming its construction. Why can't anyone explain how such massive volumes were produced without any trace of the necessary industry? There's another important point we can't ignore: logistics. In the 19th century, roads were, to put it mildly, far from modern. They weren't paved highways, but muddy dirt tracks that a cart could barely manage. So how do you deliver millions of tons of building materials to such remote, hard-to-reach places like the forests and mountains where these giant bridges were built? Considering that not just bricks, but huge stone blocks were used, it becomes obvious that simply moving the materials would have been a disaster for the local roads. To transport these masses, hundreds of thousands of carts would have been needed, hauling brick, stone, cement, tools, and food for the workers day and night. But where are the traces of this logistical collapse? There's not a single mention in any archive of such grandiose logistical operations. We don't see any documents indicating overloaded roads, destroyed infrastructure, or the creation of temporary paths to deliver materials. The whole process remains behind the scenes, and official historians are silent about it. Instead, we get dry reports about opening dates and architects' names. It feels like we're only shown the final act of the play, while all the previous, far more labor-intensive and resource-heavy stages of construction are hidden. And the strangest thing is that these bridges stand in places where they seem to have no practical purpose. Look at many of these structures. They span not only rivers and valleys, but sometimes, for no apparent reason, they cross empty, unremarkable valleys where there was no need for such a crossing. Why build such giant bridges in areas without industry or large cities? It's not just strange. It suggests that we're looking at the remains of something far more massive and technologically advanced than the infrastructure we imagine. These giant structures could have been part of a network that was destroyed or forgotten, and we're merely using the leftovers of that past without understanding their true purpose. One of the most striking features of these giant structures is the quality of their construction. When we approach the pillars of such bridges, it becomes obvious that these aren't just piles of stones held together by mortar. They are masterpieces of engineering, with a level of execution that often surpasses modern standards. This is especially noticeable when you look at the material they're made from. Granite, used to create the blocks in these bridges, is one of the hardest rocks on Earth. The question is, how could people of that time, using simple tools like a chisel and hammer, carve such perfect blocks from it? Try working granite with a chisel yourself. It's almost impossible. The steel of that time was too soft. It would have dulled after every 10 strikes. Yet on these bridges, we see perfectly fitted blocks that interlock so tightly you can't even slip a razor blade between them. This is polygonal masonry, a method where stones are held in place by their own weight and the perfect matching of their faces. But how could uneducated workers, armed with primitive tools, achieve such precision? This leads us to another level of understanding. Probably, the methods and tools used to create these structures weren't the ones described in textbooks. Perhaps technologies were used that we lack, and which, according to the official version, didn't exist in the 19th century. The perfect fitting of stones and their precise shaping could point to a highly advanced technology that was lost. These bridges might have been built using methods that were known long ago, but hidden from us for some reason. It's also worth noting the strange marks that can be found on these stones. Often on the surface of the blocks you see perfectly smooth cuts, as if they were processed not with primitive tools, but with high-speed machine mechanisms. Many blocks have characteristic grooves that could only be left by disc saws or high-speed cutters. But such technologies, we're told, only appeared in the 20th century. So the question remains, how could 19th century people, armed only with chisels and hammers, achieve such precision in granite? Perhaps a more plausible explanation lies here. One possibility is the use of cast stone technology or geopolymer concrete. These techniques suggest that local rock could have been mixed with a chemical binder and then poured into molds. This would allow the creation of such perfectly fitted stone blocks much faster than with conventional masonry, and would explain the absence of quarry traces and brick factories. If such technology really existed in the 19th century, it calls into question the entire history of engineering achievements of that time. If people could use cast stone, they possessed knowledge and methods that officially only appeared in our time. And thus we encounter the concept that many of these bridges might have been built using technologies that were forgotten or hidden from us, changing our perception of the development of human civilization. We can't help but ask, why were such bridges and viaducts built on such a grand scale and with such perfection if they weren't intended for the ordinary transport needs of that time? The bridges we see often tower over empty valleys, passing over places that today have no connection to major cities or industrial centers. The question is, why build such gigantic structures in locations that make no sense from the logic of that era? One of the most important aspects that helps us understand their purpose is the age of these objects. Many of these bridges, judging by their condition and style, could not have been built the way we are told. Sometimes it seems they were part of a much older system, a network that existed before us but was destroyed or forgotten as a result of a catastrophe. There's another disturbing detail: strange issues with the landscape around these bridges. We see bridges leading to nowhere, across empty valleys, where there were probably once rivers or densely populated lands. Sometimes, these structures seem artificially inserted into the landscape. Almost everything we know about them is tied to an era when local geographical conditions had changed dramatically. Why do these bridges lead nowhere? Why do old photographs show these objects in empty cities or on empty roads? The answer may lie in the fact that these structures were not meant to serve our time. These bridges, viaducts, and roads were part of a more global network that was destroyed, perhaps as a result of an unimaginable catastrophe, leaving us to live on the ruins of a civilization without realizing its true scale. Imagine that all these bridges and giant structures are not just ruins, but the remains of some ancient network we don't fully understand. We consider them part of our history, but what if they were actually built for another era, for another civilization? Then a frightening question arises. What happened to those who created these majestic bridges and cities? Where did the millions of people who must have used these structures disappear? How do we explain the empty streets, empty cities, empty squares and old photographs where these huge objects stand, but no people? If you look closely at historical data, you'll notice that the population in the 19th century does not match the scale of construction we see today. Census statistics show that cities were much smaller than we thought. Yet the infrastructure, houses, roads, bridges, was designed for a far larger population than official population figures of the time can explain. This creates a paradox. Where did such massive objects in these cities come from if the population didn't match their scale? We're faced with a logical inconsistency. Could it be that we, present-day humanity, are simply the descendants of those who survived a catastrophe that destroyed the old civilization? We settled already empty cities and bridges that weren't created for us. We started a new life based on what was left from a previous era, but we don't understand this. We, like squatters occupying someone else's long-abandoned ruins, don't even realize we're living in a cemetery of a great civilization. Equally strange is the fact that all the transport we use is based on old standards. Why, with rare exceptions, is the same railway gauge, approximately 143.5 centimeters, used all over the world? We're told this standard was borrowed from the axle width of Roman chariots, but have you ever considered how odd that explanation is? How could 19th century engineers, creating modern transport, base their designs on standards used 2,000 years earlier for chariots? Here's an even more important question. Why couldn't we change the gauge if railway technology advanced so much? The answer may lie in the fact that this width was dictated by already existing tracks and bridges. We couldn't simply change the wheel gauge because they wouldn't fit into already built tunnels and viaducts. Instead of adapting infrastructure to modern requirements, we were forced to adapt new transport to old standards. These bridges and viaducts, which we consider part of our history, might actually have been part of a global network that existed before us. They weren't designed for steam locomotives and freight trains, as we're told. They were planned with a completely different, more powerful, and high-speed transport in mind. One that used different principles of motion, perhaps not even based on wheel-rail friction. These bridges, with their excessive strength and construction, were part of a unified system that we've forgotten, and which now appears to us as artifacts of a distant era. Another astonishing aspect that can't be ignored are the strange architectural elements present on many bridges and viaducts. We're talking about towers, niches, and hollow spaces inside the piers, which, we're told, serve only decorative purposes. But why adorn such huge, functional structures in places where no one sees them? These elements seem excessive and absurd from a standard construction point of view. But what if they aren't decoration? What if these hollows and unusual architectural details are places for equipment? For example, resonators or collectors of atmospheric electricity. The possibility that these strange voids served to transmit energy, or for other purposes, becomes more likely when we look at these bridges as elements of a far more complex technical network than we could imagine. Instead of seeing them merely as roads for carts, we need to start seeing them as parts of a gigantic machine designed for a completely different task. The bridges we see don't just connect two riverbanks. This could have been something far larger, part of a system designed to transmit energy, perhaps even to create some kind of global network. We're used to thinking of them as transport arteries, but what if they served an entirely different purpose? These giant structures could have been elements not only of infrastructure, but of an entire energy system, transmitting information or electricity across the planet. When we begin to consider these bridges and viaducts from the perspective of a possible energy function, we inevitably encounter another strange aspect: the materials they're built from. Bridges were generally constructed from brick and granite. But what if these materials have not just a structural, but also a physical role in the system? Geologists and physicists have long known that red brick, under certain temperature conditions, contains iron oxide, which turns it into a semiconductor. And granite, from which the piers are made, is rich in quartz, a material with piezoelectric properties. When a quartz crystal is compressed, it can generate an electric current. This isn't science fiction, but simple physics you can learn in 8th grade. Now imagine this huge viaduct made of millions of tons of granite and brick, and how gravity affects its structure. These piezoelectric properties could create a weak electrical voltage, constantly generated by the force of gravity. This means these massive bridges and viaducts could be a kind of giant piezoelectric generator, working around the clock simply because they're heavy. Thus, bridges become not just transport routes, but elements of a system that could generate energy transmitted through the entire structure. But that's not all. Look at where these bridges stand. They are often located directly above water obstacles, even if there's not much water there. Flowing water isn't just a liquid, it's an electrolyte that conducts electricity. The arched construction of bridges, with their geometry, can amplify and focus the electromagnetic fields created by moving water. Thus, the bridge becomes an element of a much more complex energy network that uses natural resources to generate and transmit energy. Imagine that these giant bridges, which we perceive as simple engineering works, are actually part of a global energy grid. They could transmit not only physical mass, goods, and people, but also energy. This energy could be transmitted through the entire system of bridges, creating a network that spanned the planet. And all of this could have been part of a single planetary energy grid that used not only mechanical, but also electromagnetic principles to function. Now look at a map of these bridges' locations. Often, we see that they are positioned along straight lines that connect these bridges with mysterious earthwork fortifications known as star forts. These structures, which we once thought were defensive, might actually be elements of that same global system. They weren't protected from weapons. They were perfectly designed to work with energy waves, to receive and distribute them. These star forts aren't military objects. Their shape and structure are ideal for acoustic and energy processes. Now, if we overlay a map of bridge locations and star forts, we see a frightening pattern. They are situated at strategically important points, linking them into a single network. But what happened to this network? Why did it cease to exist? The answer could be far more sinister than we think. Perhaps this system was deliberately destroyed to hide it from future generations, to prevent us from restoring those technologies and using them for our needs. A war for control over resources and free energy could have been the reason for the disappearance of this giant network. And now, after it was destroyed, we see only its fragments, bridges and viaducts that lead to nowhere. If this global system really existed, and if its destruction was part of a war for control over energy, then the question remains, who won that war? Who was capable of destroying such a powerful network that used natural resources to create free energy? Perhaps it was those who seized power after the catastrophe, who sought to hide these technologies to maintain control over humanity. They began dismantling key elements of this system, stripping the bridges of their inner workings and leaving only the stone shells. These shells are now perceived by us as simply old, useless structures. But in reality, they are the remains of a complex energy infrastructure that once provided humanity with free energy, with no environmental pollution. Instead of restoring or developing these technologies, we became dependent on coal, oil, and gas. Energy sources that require huge resources, pollute the planet, and make us vulnerable. We lost not only the technologies of the past, but also the future we could have built if we had managed to preserve that network. In the 20th century, the demolition of old bridges and buildings, the blowing up of historical structures, this wasn't just modernization, it was a real purge. Not only old buildings were destroyed, but also the memory of high technologies that could have changed our world. Every demolished bridge, every destroyed viaduct, a lost connection to a past that was far more advanced than what textbooks tell us. All this destruction and elimination of ancient structures leads to a disturbing thought. Perhaps we've been fed a false picture of the development of human civilization. We're used to thinking that humanity's progress was gradual, with small steps from simple technologies to complex ones. But what if the truth about technologies we could have possessed long ago has been hidden from us? These bridges, viaducts, and other architectural wonders of the past may be evidence that humanity once possessed completely different methods of energy production and construction, which were lost or destroyed. If you think about it, modern energy is a source of power. Coal, oil, gas, these resources can be controlled, they can be profited from, and with them you can hold entire countries in your hands. But what if we could use the free energy generated by bridges and viaducts simply through natural resources like water or gravity. That would mean energy would become accessible to everyone, and no one could control it, thus losing their power. Those who won the war for resources and energy control might have deliberately destroyed this system. They didn't want people to have access to free energy, which could have changed the world. So they rewrote history, imposed false views on technological progress, hid knowledge of past civilizations, and created an economic model based on exhaustible resources. We look at these destroyed objects and don't understand that they aren't just ancient monuments. They are lost knowledge that could have given us a completely different reality, a world where we are not dependent on oil and coal. The bridges and viaducts we see today are not just ancient architectural monuments. They are mysterious remnants of a high-tech system that used natural forces to transmit energy. Everything we see may be only the surface of a huge iceberg, hiding the real technologies we have lost. We look at these stone structures and admire their grandeur, but we don't understand that these objects once had a completely different purpose. If we could recover the knowledge that was lost with the destruction of this global network, we might discover that energy could be transmitted without using coal, oil, and gas. These bridges and viaducts were not built for transporting goods or people. They could have been part of a system that used natural resources, for example, electromagnetic fields, piezoelectric effects, or resonant oscillations, to generate and transmit energy. Think how much the world would change if we could regain that knowledge. Not only would we free ourselves from dependence on fossil fuels, but we would also stop destroying nature in search of oil and coal. We could create a more sustainable society where energy is available to everyone, and there would be no oligarchs controlling its supply. But to achieve this, we need to realize that the true achievements of human civilization are hidden from us. We live on the ruins of what was once a great and powerful civilization, and we don't even suspect what we have lost. The bridges and viaducts standing among empty valleys and fields are only the remnants of a global system that once provided the world with energy and harmony. And now, that knowledge is lost forever. If this system really existed, then its destruction might not have been accidental. These bridges, viaducts, and star forts we see today may not just be monuments of the past, but symbols of what was lost. We're used to perceiving them as skillfully built architectural objects, but what if they were actually part of a planetary energy network? These giant structures could have been the connecting links between people and the forces of nature, through which we could obtain and use energy for free, without the need for coal and oil. But all this was destroyed, erased from the face of the earth. Why? Because those who won the global war for resources didn't want people to gain access to these technologies. They destroyed everything that could have made us independent, and they rewrote history, imposing on us a false version about the necessity of fossil fuels and the destiny of the Industrial Revolution. We're told that progress went only in one direction, from steam engines to oil and coal. But this version ignores the fact that we could have used completely different technologies, more environmentally friendly and accessible. What remains for us? We look at these ruins and find only traces of a lost civilization. Bridges and viaducts connecting empty spaces remind us that we live on the remnants of that very system, which was once based on harmony with nature and using its resources without harming the environment. If you're interested in such topics and want to learn more, don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button, and click the bell so you don't miss new videos. See you next time.